A nurse cares for a comatose Arab millionaire. Then something unbelievable happens. A hook. What if the power to save or destroy everything was inside one person? Watch as Sarah faces an impossible choice that will change the fate of the world. Will she close the door to darkness or unleash a new nightmare? Stick around till the end to find out how it all ends, because the truth is darker than you think. The mansion loomed ahead, massive and silent. A cold wind whispered through the trees. The air felt thick with tension. Sarah stepped out of the car, her boots crunching the gravel beneath her. She adjusted her nurse's uniform, trying to steady her nerves. This was her first assignment here. The gates creaked shut behind her as she approached the front door. A tall, polished man in a dark suit greeted her. He didn't smile. "Mr. Khalid is waiting," he said flatly. She nodded, unsure of what to expect. He led her down a long hallway, the walls lined with priceless art. Everything was dark, too dark for such an extravagant place. They passed rooms with closed doors, but Sarah could feel eyes behind each one. The man didn't speak as they walked. At last, they arrived at a door at the end of the hall. The man opened it slowly, and Sarah stepped inside. The room smelled sterile, almost medicinal. She froze. There, lying in a large, intricately carved bed, was Khalid, the Arab millionaire who had been in a vegetative state for 2 years. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. But something was wrong. Something in the way his chest barely rose with each shallow breath. It felt as if he were aware. Sarah walked closer, trying to ignore the cold sweat that beaded on her skin. She glanced at the monitor beside him. His vitals were stable, but there was something else. A strange pulse, irregular. A whisper of movement in his fingers. She took a step back. The room seemed colder now, the shadows darker, the silence heavier. She turned to the man who had led her here. He was already gone. Sarah was alone with him. The air seemed to close in around her. And then a voice, barely a whisper. "Help me." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She turned, but Khalid's eyes remained fixed, unblinking, empty. But the voice, it came again. "Help me." Sarah's heart raced. She took a cautious step forward, unsure of what was happening. Had she imagined it? Had he spoken? "Please," the voice begged, echoing in her mind. She reached out, her hand trembling. As her fingers touched the cool skin of his hand, a sharp chill ran up her spine. The room seemed to contract. The shadows, they moved. A whisper of sound, like a hiss, filled the air. Sarah jerked her hand back, her breath shallow and fast. The whispers grew louder, and then a sudden crash. Something broke behind her. She spun around. There was nothing there. The door slammed shut. The sound of the door closing was deafening. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears. The room was too quiet now, too still. She glanced at Khalid. His eyes were still open, unblinking, but his hand, it twitched again. The movement was slow, deliberate. Sarah stepped back, her legs shaky. The whispers came again, faint, but unmistakable. "Help me." The air felt suffocating. Her breath came out in ragged gasps. She tried to steady herself, but it was impossible. She needed to get out. Fast. The door wouldn't open. She yanked the handle, her hands slipping from the cold metal. Panic surged through her. "Let me out," she screamed, her voice echoing through the silence. The whispers grew louder, closer. Sarah spun around. Khalid's body, it was moving, slowly. His chest rose, then fell, more distinctly now. His fingers twitched again, a stronger motion, then a violent jerk. His body stiffened. Sarah gasped, stumbling backward. She could feel the temperature drop even more. The room seemed to pulse with dark energy. The shadows were alive now. They crept along the walls, stretching, writhing. Something was wrong. Something beyond explanation. Khalid's eyes flickered, just for a moment, and then they shifted, not toward her, but toward the door. There was a subtle movement, as if he were trying to reach something. The air thickened, and Sarah's heart raced. Suddenly, the door flew open with a crash. She stumbled back in shock, but no one was there. No one except Khalid. His body was still stiff, but now his hand was reaching out. It hovered, trembling. "Help me." The voice was louder now, sharper. Sarah's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. He was supposed to be unconscious, completely unresponsive. But he wasn't. Khalid's lips parted, and his voice, grew louder. "Help me," he screamed. But the scream wasn't coming from his mouth. It was coming from somewhere deeper. A voice, a force beyond the physical. Sarah's knees buckled beneath her, terror flooding her senses. She couldn't breathe, and then nothing. The room went completely silent. The silence was unbearable. It pressed in on her from all sides, suffocating. Sarah's heart raced, her eyes darting around the room. Khalid was still, his body rigid, his hand hovering just above the bed, frozen in place. But the air felt charged, as if something unseen was watching her. She could hear her breath, shallow and ragged, as it echoed in her ears. The whispers were gone, but the fear, it lingered. She took a tentative step toward Khalid, her feet heavy, like they were stuck in thick mud. Her mind screamed for her to run, to get out. But her body wouldn't obey. It was as if something was holding her in place. Her fingers brushed against the side of his bed, the cool surface grounding her. She dared a glance at his face again. His eyes were still open, empty, but they weren't staring at nothing anymore. They were locked onto hers, unblinking, unmoving. A chill ran down her spine. She could feel his gaze, deep and unsettling. The silence thickened, stretching, suffocating. And then, suddenly, Khalid's lips moved. It was the faintest motion, barely noticeable, but it was enough. "Help me," he whispered. Sarah's blood ran cold. That voice, it wasn't his. It couldn't be. It was too distorted, too hollow. The words were hollow, like they came from deep within the earth, or from somewhere far darker. And then his hand moved. Not a twitch, but a deliberate motion. Slowly, his fingers curled. Closer, closer to her. Sarah's body froze. She could hear her pulse thundering in her ears as the hand crept closer, inch by inch. It wasn't possible. It wasn't possible. But the room felt colder now, so cold her breath came out in frosty bursts. The hand reached out and brushed her own. A shock of ice shot through her skin. She gasped, pulling her hand back as if burned. Her vision blurred. She stumbled, grasping for something to steady herself. But there was nothing, only the cold, empty air. Khalid's eyes, his eyes, still followed her, unblinking, immovable. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe and twist again. Sarah's throat tightened. She felt trapped, as if the room itself was closing in on her. The whispers returned, softer now, but still too close. "Help me." The voice was unmistakable, but it wasn't coming from Khalid. It was coming from the walls, from the shadows, from everywhere. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't escape. She was locked inside with him. And she knew there was no way out. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The shadows shifted, darkening, deepening. Sarah's skin crawled. The whispers were growing louder again, like an army of voices surrounding her. "Help me." It wasn't just Khalid now. The voices echoed through the room, all at once, overlapping. She looked at Khalid again, his eyes still locked onto hers. But now, there was something else. Something moving behind them. Something darker. A shift. A subtle change. Sarah's breath quickened. The air thickened around her, pressing on her chest. She could feel the temperature drop even more. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone in her pocket, desperate to call for help. But the screen flickered when she pulled it out. Nothing. Just static. "Please, help me." The voice was louder now, unmistakable. It wasn't Khalid. It was coming from within the room. The shadows seemed to stretch toward her, reaching with unseen fingers. Sarah stumbled back, her head spinning, her heart pounding in her ears. Who is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The room went completely still. For a moment, there was nothing but her breath and the distant hum of the monitor beside Khalid. Then the voice again. But this time it was clearer, sharper. It came from Khalid's mouth. "Help me, free me." The words were slow, guttural, as if struggling to escape from somewhere deep within him. Sarah's knees gave out, and she collapsed onto the floor. She was trapped. The door was still wide open, but she couldn't move. Her body wouldn't respond. The darkness in the room seemed to close in tighter. She could feel it, the weight of something ancient, something far older than this house. "Free me." The voice came again, and this time it wasn't just a voice. It was a command. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She forced herself to her feet, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she backed toward the door. But it wasn't the door she should have been looking at. It was Khalid, his body twisted, his chest rising unnaturally, a sharp, sickening crack filling the air. His eyes began to shift, flickering from one direction to another, faster and faster. Then there was a shift in the air, a thundering silence, and then a sharp, agonized scream filled the room. Sarah's blood ran cold as the very walls seemed to shudder with the force of it. Khalid's body was no longer still. It was changing. Skeletal fingers grasped the edge of the bed, pulling his body upright with unnatural speed. His mouth opened wide, wider than it should. His voice now something alien, something ancient. "Help me," he hissed. "You're the key." Sarah's body froze in terror as she realized she wasn't just a nurse. She was part of this, part of what was happening. The shadows seemed to reach out toward her, beckoning her forward. Her limbs felt heavy, like they weren't her own. The room seemed to tilt, everything spinning around her. She could hear Khalid's voice, louder now, closer, but it was no longer his. It was something far darker. "Help me. Help me, free me." The room seemed to crackle with an unnatural energy. Sarah's eyes widened as the shadows grew thicker, moving with purpose, like they were alive. The air was suffocating, pulling her toward the bed. Khalid's body was no longer simply lying there. It had become something else, something that was once him, but now far more. His arms jerked, extending unnaturally, his fingers stretching out toward her. She could hear the bones creaking, the muscles straining in a grotesque imitation of life. "Free me," the voice came again, but this time it didn't sound human. It was deep, distorted, like something from another realm entirely. Sarah stumbled backward, her feet slipping on the cold floor. Her breath was ragged, shallow. The walls seemed to close in on her as the shadows whispered, their voices blending into a chilling cacophony. "Help me, you're the key." The words repeated over and over again, but they weren't coming from Khalid anymore. They were coming from all around her, surrounding her, filling the room. She felt a tug at her very soul. Her legs weakened, her body trembling, as though some unseen force was pulling her closer to the bed. Her mind screamed at her to move, to get out, but her body was frozen, unable to resist. Her hand reached out, almost involuntarily, toward Khalid's face. His eyes were wide now, but they were no longer the lifeless eyes of a man in a coma. They were glowing, flickering like dark embers in the deep void. Sarah's fingers hovered just inches above his skin, drawn toward him. And then a sharp, piercing pain shot through her chest. It felt like someone had driven a knife straight into her heart. She gasped, clutching at her chest, but there was nothing there. It wasn't physical, it was far deeper. She could feel it in her bones, in her blood. The shadows pulled at her, 1,000 hands dragging her closer. Her breath came in jagged bursts, her mind a blur of terror and confusion. The voice now filled her head, drowning out everything else. You are the key. The room twisted, the walls stretching and warping. She couldn't tell where the shadows began and where they ended. Her hands shook, her vision growing blurry as the darkness closed in. The pain in her chest intensified, and then Khaled's body moved. With a horrible, jerking motion, he rose from the bed, his limbs contorting in ways that defied nature. His mouth opened, and an unholy scream erupted, filling the room with a force that shook the very foundation. Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she could feel was the pull, the relentless pull of the shadows, the pull of whatever this thing was that had taken Khaled. She was too close now, too close to the dark force that had claimed him. And then Khaled's hand shot out, seizing her wrist with terrifying strength. His grip was ice cold, but the pain, oh, the pain, was beyond anything she had ever experienced. "Free me!" he growled again, but this time his voice was laced with something ancient, something evil. Sarah's world spun. She couldn't escape, and as her vision blurred to black, one final whisper lingered in her mind. "You're mine now." The world was darkness, complete and utter silence. Sarah's body felt weightless, like she was floating, suspended in an endless void. Her chest heaved, but there was no air to breathe. No light, no sound, nothing. She tried to scream, but her mouth was dry, her voice lost in the emptiness. The pain had gone, but there was an emptiness where her fear had once been. It was as if her very essence had been drained, leaving nothing but a hollow shell. Then a shift. A pulse of energy, faint at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. Sarah's senses returned slowly, painfully. The cold returned first, a biting chill that cut through her like sharp needles. She gasped, feeling the icy air invade her lungs. Her eyes snapped open. She was back in the room with Khaled. The bed was empty now. The shadows seemed to retreat, their formless shapes vanishing into the corners. The walls were still, but now they seemed different, darker, more oppressive, and there was a new sound, a slow, rhythmic thumping, a heartbeat. Her eyes shot toward Khaled's bed. He was no longer lying in it, but standing at the foot, facing her. His once rigid body now seemed fluid, alive. His eyes glowed, flickering with unnatural light, like two molten pools of fire. His mouth twisted into a grin, revealing teeth too sharp to be human. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't look away from him. Her body was still paralyzed, unable to move, to scream. The thumping grew louder, like the beating of 1,000 hearts. Khaled's lips parted, but it wasn't his voice that filled the room. It was something else, something older, more primal. "You are part of me now," the voice hissed, its tone chilling, unrecognizable. Sarah's vision blurred, and the walls around her seemed to bend, twisting into a grotesque landscape. The room had become something else, something beyond comprehension. Her mind screamed for escape, but she couldn't move. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Khaled's grin widened, his eyes burning with an unholy fire. "Because you were always meant to be here," he said, his voice now layered with an ancient, guttural tone. "You are the key." Sarah felt a cold sweat break out across her skin, but still, her body wouldn't respond. The shadows closed in around her, curling around her limbs like chains. The thumping heartbeat was now deafening, vibrating through her entire being. She felt it deep inside her, an urge to let go, to surrender, to become part of whatever Khalid had become. But something deep within her fought back. Her mind flashed to the door, to the outside world. She wasn't going to be like him, not like this. Her fingers twitched. It was the smallest of movements, but it was enough. The force that had held her, that paralyzed her, faltered for just a second. That was all she needed. With every ounce of willpower, Sarah tore her gaze away from Khalid. The shadows screamed in frustration as they whipped around her, trying to pull her back. But she fought. With everything she had, her hands found the edge of the bed, gripping the cold wood as she dragged herself away. Khalid's grin faltered, his eyes narrowing in rage. "You cannot escape," he growled, his voice twisted with power. "You are mine." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. With a final, desperate push, she hurled herself toward the door. The room seemed to shift around her, the shadows closing in, but she didn't stop. She didn't look back. The door slammed open. The bright light of the hallway pierced the darkness of the room. Sarah stumbled into the light, gasping for air, her heart pounding, her body shaking with the effort to keep moving. But the darkness didn't let go. It chased her. The hallway stretched ahead, impossibly long, the walls bending as though the house itself were alive. Sarah's footsteps echoed, harsh and frantic, as she sprinted down the corridor, the light from the open door behind her flickering in and out. She didn't dare look back. The air in the hallway was suffocating, heavy with a weight that pressed down on her chest. Her legs burned with exhaustion, but she pushed forward, her heart thundering in her ears. She had to escape. She had to get out before it was too late. But the house, it was changing. The floor beneath her feet warped, rippling like water as the shadows slithered along the walls, reaching toward her. She felt the temperature drop again, the chill creeping up her spine, the icy fingers of the darkness crawling toward her skin. The door at the end of the hall was still far away, but it was the only escape, the only way out. A sudden crash from behind her made her heart leap into her throat. She didn't turn, but she could feel it. Khalid, no, whatever he had become, was close. His presence was like a suffocating cloud, closing in on her. The thumping heartbeat vibrated through the walls, shaking the very foundation of the house. The whispers started again, filling the air with their maddening chorus. Asterisk, you are mine, asterisk. It was his voice, but not his voice. Something deeper, something older. She could feel it now, crawling into her mind. The shadows twisted, snapping at her heels as she ran. Her breath was ragged, each inhale like swallowing glass. The door was only a few steps away now, just a few more steps. But then, asterisk bang asterisk, the sound of something slamming against the wall behind her. She didn't dare look. Her pulse surged, her legs screaming in protest. But she pushed herself harder, faster. The door was right there. Just one last step. And then, the hallway stretched endlessly before her, the door now miles away. Sarah's chest tightened, the panic clawing at her throat. She couldn't breathe. The world around her warped again. The walls shifted, folding in on themselves. She spun around. The figure was there. Khalid, or whatever had taken his form, stood at the end of the hallway. He was no longer human. His body was twisted, elongated, skin stretched over bones like a grotesque puppet, his eyes glowing with a blinding intensity. He smiled, his grin widening impossibly. "You cannot escape," he hissed, the voice now layered with countless others, distorted and alien. Sarah's pulse raced as she backed away, feeling the walls close in around her. There was no way out, no escape. Her breath came in desperate gasps. And then, asterisk the heartbeat star. It was louder now, a deafening rhythm that shook her bones, reverberating through every inch of her being. The shadows reached for her, their tendrils wrapping around her limbs, pulling her toward him. She tried to scream, but the sound was choked off, drowned by the crushing weight of the darkness. The walls closed in, the light fading. And Khalid's eyes, those burning eyes, they were the last thing she saw before everything went black. The door, the hallway, the house, everything was gone. Just darkness, and the relentless, thumping heartbeat. The darkness was suffocating. Sarah's body felt like it was floating in an endless void, weightless and boundless. The heartbeat was all she could hear, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It pressed against her chest, as if it were her own, but wrong. Her head spun, and she couldn't tell if she was awake or trapped in a nightmare. Her senses were dull, distant. Was she alive? The silence stretched on, but then slowly there was a shift, a flicker, a light in the distance. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She focused on it, her mind clawing for something to latch onto. The heartbeat grew louder again, but now it wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. It felt like a pulse under her skin, inside her, pulling her toward that distant light. With a force she didn't understand, she moved toward it. Each step felt heavier, as though the air itself were trying to hold her back. Her body was tired, exhausted beyond measure. But the light was her only chance. It grew brighter the closer she got, until it was blinding. And then she was there, standing at the threshold of a place that felt both familiar and alien. It wasn't the hallway anymore. It wasn't the mansion. It was something else. The room around her was dim, but the shadows seemed to bend and twist in ways they shouldn't. The walls were jagged, like fractured glass, shards of dark energy pulsing beneath them. And there, in the center, was Khalid, or the thing that had been Khalid. He was no longer even a shadow of the man he once was. He was something otherworldly, a monstrous, towering figure made of shifting darkness and twisted light. His face was unrecognizable, just a gaping void of endless black, with burning eyes that flickered like flames. He stood, watching her unmoving, as if waiting. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears, her legs trembling beneath her. The heartbeat was deafening now, and she realized with sickening clarity that it was coming from him. From within him. "You can't escape," his voice boomed, but it wasn't just his voice. It was a chorus of voices, layered, writhing, all speaking in unison. Sarah gasped, her hands instinctively reaching for her head, as if she could block the sound, but it burrowed into her skull. The pain was overwhelming, but then, a spark star, a flicker of clarity. She saw it then, the key. It was not just him. It was the whole place, the mansion, the darkness, the shadows. They were all part of it. She was the key. She wasn't just trapped in his world. She was woven into it. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Khalid, this thing, had been waiting for her. She wasn't a nurse. She wasn't an outsider. She was part of this twisted game. The shadows surged around her, closing in like a storm. But in that moment, a wave of anger flooded through her. She refused to be its prisoner. Her chest heaved, her breath ragged, as she focused on the one thing she could control, herself. The shadows screamed as they recoiled, but they weren't retreating. They were reacting. The light, the flicker, was within her. She could feel it now. Her fingers curled into fists, the energy building in her core. She wasn't just the key. She could destroy it. She reached out, her fingers brushing the darkness around Khalid. The moment she made contact, it shrieked an inhuman, deafening sound that filled the void. The floor beneath her cracked open, the house itself groaning in agony. Khalid, the thing roared, but it wasn't just a roar. It was a scream of rage, of fear. Sarah closed her eyes as the darkness twisted around her. But she didn't flinch. The light surged. And then there was nothing but the echo of a heartbeat. Slow, distant, fading. Everything went still. For the first time in what felt like eternity, there was no sound. No heartbeat. No pulse. Just silence. The silence was thick. Unnaturally so. Sarah opened her eyes, but the world around her was empty, void of everything she had just experienced. The twisted mansion, Khalid, the darkness. It was all gone. The air felt lighter, almost too light, as though gravity itself had been altered. She stood alone in a place that didn't feel like any reality she knew. There was no sound, no hum, no whispers, no pounding heartbeat. Only a stillness that seemed to press against her, like a wall closing in. But it was different now. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest. She could feel the blood rushing in her ears. But there was no other sound. No whispers of shadows. No ominous pulse. The world around her was simply empty. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling, the skin pale, the fingertips cold. But there was something else, something new. A faint glow flickered at the edge of her vision, and she turned quickly, heart racing. Before her, just beyond her reach, a figure stood in the distance. A silhouette, familiar but distant. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped closer, and the world around her seemed to shift, bending like the remnants of a dream. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadows that seemed to cling to it. But there was a clarity now, a presence that was undeniable. Khalid, not the twisted thing she had just faced, but something more human. His eyes, those same eyes, burned with a soft, steady glow. "You're free now," he said, his voice gentle. But it echoed in her mind like a distant memory. Sarah took a step back, her mind swirling, heart racing. The shadows seemed to gather again at the edge of the light, swirling and flickering like they were alive. But they were not the same. They were receding, fading into the nothingness around her. What did you do to me?" she asked, her voice trembling. But there was something she could not deny, the strange pull she still felt toward him. Khalid's face softened, his expression sorrowful. "I didn't want this for you," he murmured, stepping closer, his gaze intense, yet filled with an impossible kind of regret. The shadows around them seemed to flicker like dying embers. "You were the key," he continued, "but not in the way I thought." Sarah's chest tightened. She didn't understand. The emptiness inside her churned, dark and confusing. But there was something else. Something powerful. A force inside her that felt ancient. You knew I would come," she whispered, realizing with horror that this had all been planned. Her arrival. Her being there. "Yes," he answered softly, a regretful, almost sorrowful smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "But you were never meant to be trapped. It was never supposed to be like this." He took another step toward her, and now the air felt different, charged, alive, with something they both shared. "Then why let me be part of this?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising. "What do you want from me?" Khalid's expression shifted, the flickering light in his eyes dimming slightly. "I didn't want to, but I had no choice. There are things beyond us, things that cannot be undone." His voice lowered. "Asterisk, you were meant to end this, asterisk." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Sarah's thoughts spun wildly. The power she had felt within her, the strange connection she had with this place, it all began to make sense. But how could she end something like this? What could she possibly do? Khalid looked at her, his face softening further, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something human in him, something lost. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You are the only one who can stop it now." Sarah felt the weight of his words sink into her. The emptiness inside her roared. The darkness wasn't gone. It was waiting. For her. For them. She had to make a choice. But did she have the power to end this? Or would she become part of it, just as Khalid had once been? The air around them thickened, swirling with a deep, oppressive force. And before she could answer, everything around her began to collapse, the world shattered. The floor beneath Sarah's feet cracked open, the pieces of reality splintering apart like glass. The shadows twisted violently, swirling, as if the very fabric of the universe was unraveling. Sarah's heart raced as the ground beneath her crumbled, leaving her teetering on the edge of an abyss that seemed to stretch into eternity. Khalid reached out for her, his hand just inches away, but the air between them was thick with an unexplainable force, as if something powerful was pulling them apart. "No," she shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the chaos. "What's happening?" Khalid's face was no longer soft, no longer filled with regret. It had become something unreadable, a mask of desperation. "You have to act now," he cried, his voice full of urgency. "It's too late to stop it, but you, only you, can control the aftermath." Sarah's mind was spinning, the reality around her warping as the shadows closed in, lashing out like angry serpents. She didn't know what to do. What could she do? She was no longer just a nurse. She was something more, something far beyond anything she could understand. The heartbeat, the pulsing energy within her. It wasn't just a remnant of the darkness. It was hers, too. Her hands began to glow again. But this time, the glow was different. It wasn't cold or distant. It burned with a heat she had never known. She could feel the pull of the shadows, like they were part of her, part of everything she had become in this place. "You have the power to rewrite everything," Khalid urged, stepping closer. The ground cracked beneath his feet, and he seemed to hesitate for the first time. "You can undo what has been done. You can send it all away, end it." Sarah's breath was ragged. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, to find the door and leave this nightmare behind. But there was no door, no way out. She was the key. She could feel it now, her role, her purpose. The energy inside her was not just destructive. It was restorative, too. But what would it restore? The light around her pulsed, threatening to consume her, and yet there was still a part of her that resisted. She glanced at Khalid, his once burdened expression now hopeful. He had seen it, the moment of clarity, the power. But power came with a price. The swirling darkness seemed to whisper around her, urging her to make her choice. Would she embrace the chaos, the power to undo everything, or would she succumb to the inevitable, becoming a part of the very force that had taken Khalid? Her pulse was deafening. Her skin burned with the power that surged inside her. The heartbeat. It was still there, distant, but so close. It wasn't just in her, it was in everything. The walls, the ground, the space between her and Khalid. It was the rhythm of the universe. The light flickered one final time, and Sarah realized what she had to do. She wasn't just part of this world. She was the answer to its fate. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath, and with every ounce of strength, she pushed forward, her hands reaching for the power inside her. Khalid's face twisted in agony, but then, asterisk happened. The energy around her exploded. A blinding flash of light engulfed the entire room, and Sarah's body seemed to vibrate with the force of it. The darkness began to shriek, pulling back in every direction, unraveling like a twisted knot. The heartbeat faltered, then stopped. A deep, resounding silence fell over everything. When the light dimmed and the world began to settle, Sarah opened her eyes. The darkness was gone. The walls, the broken reality were gone. And there, standing before her, was Khalid. But this time he was whole. His eyes, once burning with the glow of darkness, now seemed to reflect something else, something human. He was no longer a force of torment, but a man, once again. And Sarah, though weary, knew she had made her choice. The power inside her had not destroyed her. It had freed them both. They were both standing at the edge of a new reality, one that was no longer defined by the darkness. Khaled's voice was soft, filled with awe. "You did it," he whispered. "You ended it. You saved us." Sarah looked around, the air now still and pure. But even in that silence, she knew this was only the beginning. The darkness had been banished, for now. But there would always be something lurking, waiting. And she, now part of this strange world, would be ready. Sarah stood there, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. The air was thick with the absence of the darkness, yet the emptiness around her felt alive, somehow. It was a delicate balance now, a fragile calm that hung between worlds. The power that had surged within her was still there, pulsing softly beneath her skin, reminding her of everything she had just done. Khaled stepped closer, his expression unreadable, his eyes studying her. For the first time, there was no malice, no hunger in them, just something quiet, perhaps even grateful. But Sarah couldn't shake the unease in her chest. Something wasn't right. This silence, it was too perfect, too still. Khaled reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her arm. "We have time now," he said softly, his voice almost tentative. "The world is different. The shadows are gone. The nightmare is over." Sarah nodded slowly, her gaze flicking around the void that had replaced the mansion. The twisted corridors, the suffocating dark that had consumed everything, were gone. But in their place was a vast, endless expanse, an emptiness that stretched far beyond what she could comprehend. Khaled, too, seemed uneasy now, his gaze darting around as if he was searching for something. His once steadfast confidence seemed to waver, the weight of everything they had done sinking in. "Something's wrong," Sarah whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, a chill crawling up her spine. Khaled turned sharply toward her, his face tightened. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Sarah's voice trailed off. "I can feel it. There's still something here." The air crackled. A pulse, a flicker of energy, ran through the space between them. It was faint, but undeniable. A whisper of the darkness that had been banished, a remnant, lingering in the folds of this new reality. Khaled's eyes darkened. He stepped back instinctively, as though something in his mind was finally clicking into place. "No." His voice dropped to a low murmur, a warning. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, a deep, low rumble vibrating through the air. The space around them began to shift once more, the void warping and folding in on itself, twisting as if the world itself were being torn apart again. "No," Khaled shouted, his voice rising in panic. He reached for Sarah's arm, pulling her toward him as the void seemed to expand, pulling them into its dark heart. "What's happening?" Sarah gasped, her chest tightening with the terror of what she feared was returning. The answer came as the space around them started to break apart, revealing shapes, shadows, just out of reach. There was a growing presence, something far larger, far older than anything they had faced before. The heartbeat, the pulse. "Asterisk, no asterisk," Khaled cried, and for the first time, there was genuine fear in his eyes. The shadows began to form, but they were not like the ones before. They were alive, massive, swirling masses of darkness, tendrils reaching for them like hungry claws. Sarah felt it then, a dark weight pressing on her mind. Something ancient, something she couldn't fully comprehend, was awakening from within the fabric of this new world. "The doorway," Khaled whispered frantically. "We have to close it. We have to seal it. Before it's too late." She looked around, frantic, but the swirling void was closing in faster than she could react. There was no clear path, no clear way out. "I don't know how," Sarah screamed, her hands trembling, the light within her flickering. Khalid's face hardened, his grip tightening on her arm. You do. You always have. The world around them was collapsing, folding into a chaotic whirlwind of darkness and light. But in that moment, Sarah realized something. The power inside her. It wasn't just a key. It was a conduit to something else, something far older than either of them. She could feel it deep within her, the connection to whatever this force was, whatever had been behind the darkness all along. Her hand raised instinctively, as if the power within her had a will of its own. The light inside her blazed, brighter now, reaching out to the swirling chaos. No, she whispered, trembling. I can't control it. I'm not ready. Khalid's voice broke through her panic, calm and desperate. You have no choice. You were born for this. Close it, Sarah. Close it now. Her fingers clenched into a fist. The pulse inside her surged, roaring to life. And then everything went black. The blackness swallowed them whole. For a moment, Sarah couldn't tell where she was. The world around her had disintegrated into a deep void, as if time itself had fractured into 1,000 pieces. Her senses were overwhelmed by the darkness. Heavy asterisk, suffocating and endless. But then, slowly, a faint glow began to emerge. Faint at first, like a dying ember. It wasn't the same light, not the soft, comforting glow she had felt before. This one felt different, cold, hollow, almost like a warning. She tried to move, but her body felt frozen, rooted to the spot. Khalid was beside her, his face tense, his eyes wide with fear, but even he seemed unable to act. The darkness that surrounded them was pulling at their very souls, a pressure that pushed against her chest. The heartbeat. It started again, slow at first, then faster, louder, more insistent. Her breath quickened, and her head throbbed with the force of it, as if the sound was vibrating through her entire being. It was almost as if the pulse was trying to push through her, to consume her. You have to do it, Sarah. Khalid's voice broke through her panic, strained and desperate. His eyes were no longer calm. You can't let it win. Sarah's heart raced. Her mind screamed for escape, for any way out. But the light, the cold, insidious light, was growing brighter, pulsing with the rhythm of the heartbeat. The shadows swirled around them like a storm, alive, ravenous, as if the very fabric of existence was being devoured by them. She closed her eyes, struggling to breathe, feeling the weight of the situation suffocating her. It's too much. And then a flash, a memory, faint, distant, but clear. She saw the mansion, the crumbling walls, the broken windows, the whispers in the dark. The shadows had always been there, lurking. She remembered Khalid's eyes, his pain, his desperation. She remembered the moment she felt the pull, the power inside her, rising to the surface. That power wasn't just hers. It was the world's. She realized, suddenly, what she had to do. She wasn't just part of this world. She was the key to it, its balance, its life. Sarah forced her eyes open. The light around her burned now, but she focused on it. She reached for it, every fiber of her being pulling toward that cold glow, embracing it. Her hand trembled, but she reached out anyway. As her fingers brushed the air, something shifted. The darkness recoiled. She could feel it. Asterisk at asterisk, the source. The very thing that had created this nightmare. The thing that had brought the shadows into existence. With a guttural roar, the heartbeat reached its crescendo. And then, with a force that shook her to the core, Sarah let go. She opened herself to the power, asterisk all of its star. The light, the darkness, the pulse. The ground beneath her cracked. The air around her crackled with energy. And then everything stopped. The heartbeat, the darkness, the cold light, The shadows that had been clawing at her mind, they vanished. The pressure on her chest disappeared. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sarah could breathe again. She looked around, her body trembling, her chest still heaving from the effort. The void had receded, leaving behind nothing but a deep, overwhelming silence. Khalid stood before her, eyes wide in disbelief, but there was no longer fear in his gaze. There was only awe. "It's gone," he whispered, his voice almost reverent. "You did it." Sarah stared at him, her mind still trying to process what had just happened. The darkness that had consumed them, the chaos that had nearly torn them apart, it was all gone. But the stillness that remained felt heavy, as if something was waiting. The air felt different, but not in a comforting way. There was a tension, like the calm before a storm. "What now?" she whispered, barely able to speak. The weight of what they had just faced, what she had just done, hung over her like a shadow of its own. Khalid's eyes softened, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. But there was no relief in his expression, only the understanding that something had shifted, and neither of them would ever be the same. "I don't know," he said softly, "but we've changed it. You have changed it." Sarah's body felt drained, but she couldn't relax. Not yet. Because deep within her, that pulse, that power, it was still there. The world around them was still unsettled. She could feel the energy shifting, could feel the fabric of reality bending around them. The true battle had never been about the darkness. It had always been about the power within her. And as the silence stretched on, Sarah knew that the hardest part was yet to come. She had won, but at what cost? And what would it mean for the world they had just saved? The silence felt endless. The weight of the moment pressed on Sarah's chest, each breath feeling like it might be her last. She couldn't shake the feeling that something else was still lingering, that the power within her hadn't finished its work. Khalid stood beside her, his presence a steadying force, but his eyes betrayed a growing unease. His fingers twitched at his sides as if the calm, the stillness, was an illusion, as if he knew that the worst might still be ahead. Sarah took a tentative step forward, the ground beneath her feet feeling different. Firm, solid, but there was a hum to it, a subtle vibration in the air that made her skin crawl. She closed her eyes, focusing on the pulse inside her, the energy that still burned within her chest. It was quieter now, more subdued, but it was there, waiting. And that's when she felt it, a faint tremor, a ripple that spread through the air like a wave. It was subtle at first, but the longer she focused, the more it grew. The pulse wasn't just inside her, it was in everything. The world was vibrating, a deep hum resonating through the very fabric of reality. "Sarah," Khalid's voice was low, urgent, but tinged with fear. "Do you feel that?" Sarah didn't answer at first. She wasn't sure she could, her thoughts scattered by the sensation that was rapidly intensifying. The pulse was building again, but this time it wasn't just darkness or light. It was something else. "I felt it before," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not over." The darkness, it wasn't just here. It spread. Khalid's gaze sharpened, his body stiffening with understanding. The doorway, his voice faltered. "It was never just here. The shadows, the energy that you felt, it's a part of something greater. It stretches across more than just this reality." Sarah turned to face him fully, her heart racing in her chest. She could see it now clearer than ever. The fragments of reality that had collapsed before, they hadn't been destroyed. They'd been scattered. A tear, a crack, a door left open. This thing we've been fighting," she whispered, her hands trembling as the power inside her surged again. "It's everywhere." It wasn't bound by walls or the mansion. It was just waiting. Khalid's face tightened, as if the gravity of the situation was settling in for the first time. If it's waiting, then it's not done. It will return. She shook her head, trying to shake the overwhelming sense of dread creeping up her spine. But we sealed it. We sent it away. We only sealed this world. The doorway, his voice trailed off. It was a tether, a connection. The power you felt, it was meant to break that tether. But there are others, other doors. Sarah's blood ran cold. Other doors. Khalid nodded, his face pale. And every one of them is still open. The air around them pulsed again, the hum of reality vibrating even more violently, like a distant thunderclap, too far to hear, but too close to ignore. The ground beneath them shook, more forcefully this time, and Sarah stumbled, her hand reaching out for Khalid, instinctively trying to steady herself. But the tremors were growing. It wasn't just the world around them trembling. It was the very fabric of everything, the balance between light and dark, life and death, tearing apart. Khalid's eyes widened, his gaze fixing on something in the distance. "There's no time," he said, his voice suddenly hard, his expression filled with purpose. "We have to stop it before it spreads." Sarah's mind raced. She wanted to understand, wanted to make sense of everything, but the only thing that mattered now was stopping the chaos from consuming everything. "There are doors," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "And the power. **I**. I'm the one who opened them." Khalid nodded, his jaw tight with resolve. "You didn't open them willingly, but now you are the key to shutting them." Sarah's stomach twisted. The responsibility, the weight of it. "Then how?" she asked, fear seeping into her voice. He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers, a mix of sorrow and determination in his gaze. "**You have the power to close them. All of them. But you'll have to make the hardest choice." Sarah's pulse quickened. What choice? The darkness that had once been banished. The shadows. They were still here, star. And in that moment, Sarah realized with terrible clarity that the power she had harnessed wasn't just a weapon against the dark. It was a choice between her humanity and the endless responsibility that came with her power. She closed her eyes, feeling the world tremble beneath her feet once more. Khalid's hand rested on her shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "You must decide, Sarah," he said quietly, "to walk away from this, to leave it all behind, to let it consume the world again, or to embrace what you've become." The light inside her flared again, stronger than ever, and the world trembled once more. The choice was hers. The weight of his words hung in the air, pressing down on Sarah like a physical force. She could feel the energy inside her, pulsing, swirling, a storm that threatened to tear her apart. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, a power that stretched beyond comprehension. And yet, with that power came a choice. The choice to either sever it, to turn her back on everything she had become, or to embrace it fully, knowing the cost. The world around her trembled again, and Sarah realized that every moment she hesitated, the darkness, the shadows, were growing stronger, slipping through the cracks, creeping into the spaces where the doors still lay open. She turned to face Khalid, her heart pounding. His face was filled with resolve. But there was something else there, too, a deep sorrow, as if he, too, understood the weight of what she had to decide. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly, his voice soft but filled with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "I'm here. I will help you." But even as he spoke, the ground beneath them shuddered again, and the air thickened with a familiar presence. The shadows, the pull of the unknown. "You don't understand," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "This is not just about me. It's about the world. It's about everything." Her body was trembling now, the light inside her flickering in tandem with her rapid heartbeat. There was no turning back. There hadn't been for a long time. Khalid stepped closer, his voice firm. Sarah, you have always been more than just a nurse. You've always been the one who could stop it, the one who can seal it. She closed her eyes, her breath shallow, as she tried to steady her thoughts. The world felt too big, too heavy, and yet too small at the same time. This was the moment she had been born for, whether she wanted it or not. But what if she wasn't strong enough? What if the power inside her was more than she could control? Her fingers curled into fists, and with that, the power surged again, flooding her veins, making her feel as if she were on fire. Asterisk Sarah! Asterisk Khalid's voice broke through the storm inside her. She opened her eyes to find him standing there, watching her, waiting, and that was when she knew. There was no choice but to embrace it. No turning back. She was the key. The force within her wasn't something she could walk away from. It was her destiny, her burden, her power to wield. "I have to stop this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have to close the doors." Khalid nodded, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with something Sarah couldn't quite place. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was acceptance. And then the power inside her swelled, radiating outward, pulsing in time with the vibrations of the world. It felt like the very fabric of existence was shaking, breaking apart at the seams. The shadows grew, swarming around her, alive, clawing at her mind, whispering promises of freedom, of escape. But she couldn't listen. She wouldn't. Her hands trembled as she raised them, but the light that poured from her fingertips was fierce, burning with the intensity of 1,000 suns. The energy she had felt so many times before, the darkness, the light, began to merge, a force that was both destructive and healing. She could feel the weight of the doors, the cracks in reality, pulling at her. They were everywhere, hidden in the fabric of this world and the next. But she knew now. She knew what she had to do. Her voice, barely a whisper, rang out in the stillness. "I will close the doors. All of them." The energy flared one final time, the force building inside her, ready to break free. And with a single earth-shattering pulse, the world shattered again. The cracks began to close, slowly, painfully. The light inside Sarah's hands erupted, growing, expanding, filling the void with a blinding brilliance. The shadows screamed. Sarah's body burned with the effort, but she held on. She held the power. She had to. The cracks sealed. The doors that had been left open began to close. One by one, the shadows faded, screaming in anguish as they were forced back into the nothingness from which they came. And then, all at once, the world fell silent. For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. The power inside her was spent. Her body felt empty, hollow, but the world around her was still, at peace. The light inside her dimmed, but it didn't vanish. It remained quiet, gentle, a constant hum that reminded her of everything she had done. Khalid stood beside her, his expression unreadable. But when he looked at her, there was something different in his eyes, something softer. "You did it," he said softly. "You saved us." Sarah nodded, her mind reeling. She had done it. She had closed the doors. But at what cost? The weight of what she had just done sank in, and she realized something. The world had been saved, but the power she had embraced, the burden she carried, would never truly leave her. And as she looked at Khalid standing there beside her, she knew that no matter how still the world was now, there would always be another door, another choice, and she would always be the one to close it. Sarah stood motionless in the aftermath, the pulse inside her now a quiet hum, steady and constant. The shadows had retreated, their screams swallowed by the silence that had returned to the world. The weight of her actions hung heavy on her shoulders, but the calm, the stillness that surrounded her, felt both peaceful and unsettling. She had closed the doors. The fractures in reality had healed. The darkness had been banished. For now. Khalid was beside her, his eyes reflecting something that wasn't just gratitude but understanding. They had both crossed a line they couldn't uncross, and now the world, their world, had changed forever. "You really did it," Khalid said softly, almost as if he couldn't believe it himself. He reached out and gently touched her arm, his fingers warm against her cool skin. Sarah didn't answer immediately. Her mind was elsewhere, drifting through the memory of every pulse of power she'd felt, every crack in the world she'd sealed. Was this really over? Or was this just another temporary reprieve, a brief calm before the storm? "What now?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, filled with a quiet uncertainty. "Is it truly over, Khalid?" He looked at her, his gaze soft but distant, as if he, too, was searching for answers in the silence. "It is," he said finally, though his voice held an edge of doubt. "But the balance, the world, it will never be the same." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of that truth. The power inside her hadn't just been a tool, it was a part of her now. And as much as she wanted to believe that the doors had been closed forever, deep down, she knew that the balance was fragile. The world was calm, but only for a moment. Khalid's expression shifted as he took a step back, his gaze darkening. "You know as well as I do, Sarah, this peace is not eternal." The hum in the air seemed to grow louder, more insistent. The quiet wasn't what it seemed. Sarah turned to him, a chill crawling up her spine. "What do you mean?" The shadows in the distance flickered, and Sarah felt it, deep inside her, where the power still thrummed. "There's always another door," Khalid whispered, waiting to be opened, and somewhere in the depths of her mind, Sarah knew he was right. Sarah stood in the aftermath, her eyes searching the horizon, feeling the quiet that had replaced the chaos. The world around her seemed almost unreal, too still, as if time itself had paused to catch its breath. The power that had once roared within her now lay dormant, but it was there, quiet, waiting. Khalid was by her side, his presence solid and reassuring, but she could sense the shift in him. The battle was over, but the scars would remain. He had seen her face the darkness, seen the strength she wielded, but she could feel that same doubt creeping into him now. They both knew that the world they had saved wasn't the same as it had been. The door, the cracks in reality, they weren't just sealed. They had been changed. Sarah looked up at him, her voice soft but sure. "It's over, Khalid. At least for now." Khalid met her gaze, his eyes searching hers for something. Reassurance, perhaps, or understanding. But there was something else in his eyes now, a quiet acceptance. "You're right," he said, his voice steady but tinged with an unspoken weight. "It's over. But the world will always need someone to watch over it, someone to protect it from what lies beneath." Sarah nodded, understanding the burden of his words. She had closed the doors, sealed the darkness, but she was forever tied to that power, the responsibility now embedded deep within her. "We both knew this moment would come," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that no matter what we did, there would always be another door, another crack." Khalid stepped closer, his hand resting on her shoulder, the connection between them a silent promise. "And we'll be ready when it comes." Together, the air felt heavier now, but there was a certain peace that settled between them. The darkness was gone for now, but Sarah understood what Khalid meant. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She wasn't just someone who healed wounds. She was the keeper of a delicate balance, a silent guardian of the world's fragile peace. The world, it seemed, would always need someone to close the doors, and that someone was her. The wind stirred gently, whispering a promise. For now, the fight was over, but the journey, it seemed, had only just begun. The final door had closed, but the next one was waiting,